The Zelda franchise is a series that seems to produce a lot of bangers consistently. Each game in the series is very consistently quality, which is why criticisms of the games often feel like splitting hairs. However, there are some parts of the series that are less ventured, but certainly more criticized, and these parts are known as the games for the Philips CDI, a weird console CD player thing. So, there are these three games that sort of sit in a weird spot in Zelda history. Each one was not published or developed by Nintendo, something new for the franchise. Instead, they were published by Philips themselves for their system, but they outsourced development. The development teams of these games are split. Link, the Faces of Evil, and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon were both developed by a different team than the third game, Zelda's Adventure, and believe me, you will notice when we get to that game the stark difference in style and presentation. Notably, Zelda the Wand of Gamelon and Zelda's Adventure, as their titles imply, feature Zelda as the main character as opposed to Link, which is still something the main series has never done and is probably one of the few ideas that these games had that I like. The two teams decide to take inspiration from different games in the series. Animation Magic, the developers behind the first two, decide to take cues from Zelda II with a side-scrolling perspective, which honestly was not a great idea, while Viridis used the top-down perspective of most Zelda games and somehow ended up making an even worse game. These games were made after Philips had already gotten the rights from Nintendo to use the characters, and what did Philips decide to do with those rights? Squander them. They made these games with very little budget or time, and Nintendo provided no input whatsoever. It certainly didn't help that the CDI itself was not actually designed as a game console and was mostly just a CD player. Also, because Philips was so proud of their full-motion video technology, they used FMVs in all three games and forced them onto the development teams. The animation in the first two is, something, and the live-action ones in Zelda's Adventure are even worse, for reasons we'll get into later. Since the CDI didn't sell very well, these games didn't sell very well either. Apparently the reception to Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon was a lot more mixed back in the day, as opposed to today where all three of the games are pretty much universally hated. Honestly, I can't see why the reception was mixed. There's really very little merit to these games. Today we're going to look into each of these games and figure out what the hell happened here as a celebration of Zelda Month. You know, nothing says celebration like digging up the worst part of a franchise's legacy. Let's dig a bit into the background of these games before we get into each individual one. In the ancient year of 1989, Nintendo signed a deal with Sony to create a disc reader called the Nintendo PlayStation, a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo which would allow for those cool FMVs or something. However, Nintendo decided to create their own biggest rival by backstabbing Sony and partnering with Philips instead to make this add-on. When things went south with the Sega CD add-on, Nintendo decided they didn't want a CD add-on anymore, and as compensation let Philips do whatever they wanted with some of their properties, which of course included the Zelda series. And now look where Sony is and how these games are remembered. Maybe you should have just worked with Sony, guys. Philips decided to contract out to independent studios for the games, and those studios created games that barely resemble the Zelda series, that being the only inspiration they used were art from the instruction manuals for the characters. Again, because the console was not designed as a gaming console, the controls are laggy, there are numerous problems with streaming audio and memory, and especially graphics, despite how much Philips touted them as being high resolution in the lead up to release. Due to the significantly different graphical styles of these games, I'll be talking about the issues more in detail when we get to them. Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon were both revealed at 1993 CES, which at first inspired confidence due to the quality of the animation. However, Zelda's Adventure was quietly released without even so much as a reveal. I don't know how this animation was ever seen as passable. Dragon's Lair had come out a decade earlier with much better animation. Granted, that was an arcade game, which had a much more powerful machine than a home console, but it's been 10 years. Maybe Nintendo loyalists were even a thing in 1993, I wouldn't be surprised considering how much the console war was pushed. So let's get into the two games developed by Animation Magic first, as they are easily the most infamous. Link, the Faces of Evil, and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. These two games were developed at the same time and released on the same day, and that's probably why they both suck. An unfocused development team this small in size is not a recipe for a good time. In each game, you play as the main character from the game's title with different stories. Well, barely different, but whatever. Link goes to save Zelda from Ganon, which you know is pretty par for the course at this point, and Zelda goes to save Link from Ganon, which is just the same thing, but in reverse. There are 2 new worlds to explore, one for each game, Korodai and Gamelon. Now, there are some games this really works for, namely the split versions of the Oracle games really work in my opinion. But these games don't thematically complement each other in the same way. The Oracle games are based around combat and puzzle solving respectively, and their dungeons and items reflect that. The magnet gloves are fun to get around combat encounters with, and the switch hook is a much more thought-provoking version of the hook shot for its usage in puzzles. However, the first 2 CDI games just essentially feel like the same game, with no notable complementary ideas or design choices. Again, this is probably due to the low budget and incredibly small team. They were forced to make both games on $600,000 in just 1 year with a team of 6, including some additional help from students at Cambridge University to create the backgrounds. For the animation, the company flew in some Russian animators for the project. In fact, if you want to get really pretentious, you might say that the end of the Cold War easing political tensions between the United States and Russia is what directly led to the first 2 Zelda CDI games looking the, interesting way they do. Regardless, it's no surprise these 2 games were as bad as they ended up being with the small budget, time frame, and amount of people on the project. These 2 games have weird mechanics. This is one of the few games I've ever seen without experience points where grinding is necessary. In this case, you have to grind for rubies, which is this game's weird bastardization of the main Zelda series currency, rupees. That name change gets a lot of shit, but I personally don't think it matters that much. I just think it's kind of weird. What I care more about is how, in order to get them, you have to stab them directly with your sword, which makes grinding even more tedious than it would be normally. Anyway, the combat itself plays like Adventure of Link, but significantly less fun. Whereas Adventure of Link has the down thrusts and magic spells to make combat more mechanically varied in spite of how naturally clunky and unfun it is, this game has absolutely nothing aside from your sword stamina and the occasional sword beam, which both feel stiff as hell to use. The only other items you get throughout the game are lamp oil, rope, and bombs, which you can buy from the shopkeeper. Of course, this is where Faces of Evil stands tall, because that game's shopkeeper is the beloved meme character Morshu, whereas nobody would be able to tell you the name of the Wand of Gamelon shopkeeper. That guy has some funny animations too, I guess. Morshu is just incredibly powerful. Man has 2 lines of dialogue in the original game, and he's been extrapolated into this legendary character, and I have a lot of respect for that. Much like most Zelda games, your health is measured in hearts, and if you lose them, you tend to die. Unlike most Zelda games, however, when you die, you can continue from the screen you first died at, which is a really great feature. That is, until it isn't. You see, this only works for the first 2 deaths, before the 3rd one boots you back to the world map for no goddamn reason. It's an incredibly frustrating and odd design choice. They got it partially right, so why ruin it? I'm genuinely confused. It's probably just a symptom of the arcade era of game design. A lot of shitty save systems are like that. Money extracting methods that only work in the context of an arcade game being applied to other contexts anyway, because it was industry standard. With 2 games, we have 2 plots to go over. So, in Link the Faces of Evil, the game opens with one of the most infamous cutscenes of all time. You know, the one where the My Boy meme comes from and stuff. He gets sent to Korodai by some weird guy named Gwonum, and holy shit, this dude is crazy. Gwonum easily elevates the experience of Link the Faces of Evil just by his own absurd existence. He's probably the 3rd most iconic CDI NPC, just behind King Harkinian and, of course, Morshu. After traveling around the island for long enough aimlessly and just beating up a bunch of Ganon's minions, Link eventually comes across the Book of Korodai, which is apparently the only thing that can beat Ganon. You know, it's not like there are any swords specifically forged for that purpose or anything. You gotta throw a book at him. I genuinely don't think there's a final boss fight in this game. I think it's just a poorly animated cutscene of Link throwing a book at Ganon. Anyway, Korodai is saved, which is whatever. The bad animation really saved this game and its sister game from being totally forgettable. The other game basically has the same plot, except with a few added twists. Zelda is initially sent to Gamelon because the king and Link go missing after trying to help out a certain person named Duke Onkled. Again, this premise is pretty unique for a Zelda game, and I like it, especially with the twist that Duke Onkled was actually working for Ganon and sent them there to go missing on purpose. I mean, it's not much, but it sticks out among the Zelda stories. Royal political betrayal isn't the usual villain modus operandi. Sadly, the rest of the game is essentially the same as the Faces of Evil. You go around beating up Ganon's minions and getting Link out of a mirror, I guess. Duke Onkled does have to scrub the floors, so that's good. You know, pretty lenient punishment for betraying the entire kingdom, but whatever. I think a big thing that really hurts these stories is the fact that they're tied to the Zelda games. Like, every character in these games is an original Phillips character besides Link, Zelda, Ganon, and Impa. So it's just really weird to see these characters essentially tacked into an alternate universe fanfiction. I think the stories of these games would have been a lot more interesting had they used original characters that have no attached context or history. Well, I can't promise they'd be any good, but more interesting, definitely. So that's Wand of Gamelon and Faces of Evil. Both of these games are terrible to play with horrible platforming, clunky controls, lots of input lag, and bad collision detection. The cutscenes are really ugly to this day, and the voice acting is almost worse. But at least the bad cutscenes have led to a lot of entertainment value, even though they were originally never intended to draw that response. However, there's still that other game to talk about in this particular patch of Zelda history. Zelda's Adventure, as mentioned before, is an oddity in the CDI series of games. Obviously, it was developed by a different team of people, so it was bound to be different. How much more different it is? Oh my god, I don't even know where to begin with this. So, imagine you're Philips in 1993. Your rushed and bad games have bombed in sales. What do you do next? Make another rushed and bad game. Zelda's Adventure was handed off to Viridis with only 8 months for development, which is even less than the other two games. This time, Philips gave them explicit instructions to base their game on a link to the past and study gameplay from that, which is why there's a change in perspective. But don't worry, the game still had FMV cutscenes, just different ones. Live action ones that are even worse. So this entire game is also in live action. All the sprites and all the backgrounds, which is an interesting choice. Apparently a lot of the footage used for this was taken from helicopter videos of Hawaii and also Santa Monica Bay, which is really neat. Tell your partner that the honeymoon plans are for the Zelda's Adventure place in Santa Monica. Trust me, I'm sure they'll be receptive to the idea. However, this decision was what led to a lot of the game's RAM usage being depleted. The photos were simply too big for the console, and it led to the game scrolling very slowly, which is something incredibly infuriating while playing. Most of the developers were not happy with this decision, but they ended up going forward with it anyway because of how much work was put into it. In order to get the sprites for the characters, they used cameras pointing up at mirrors so as to get a top-down perspective. Apparently this actually took more time than just mounting cameras on the ceiling, but they still just did it for some reason. Oh, and the reason the acting was so bad, it was all done by in-house staff. I feel bad for them because none of them are professionally trained actors, but they're all expected to do a good job here. The game's development was a fucking nightmare. According to the developers, the game needed at least 2 more years of testing before it should hit release. Much more music was composed for the game than was necessary, and most areas of the game ended up not even having proper background masking. It didn't help that the president of the company tried his hardest to push the team to their limits despite the strict deadlines. Apparently the original goal he pushed on them was 600 screens and 100 NPCs with a total of 300 hours in playtime, which ended up of course only being a handful of NPCs and screens in the final product, with a 12-hour runtime being the average. Oh yeah, and there was only one programmer on site who did the entire game. If you thought the first 2 CDI games had hellish development cycles, then this is super hellish. I can't imagine how hard it was for the team to work on this game, and I hope they all made it out the other side okay. I don't think they did though, as some of them say that the game had no budget, which is very concerning to hear, although it could be an exaggeration. I think all of that context is important to understand why this game is even worse than the first 2 CDI games. But let's talk about the actual game. Holy shit, don't let the shift to top-down perspective fool you. This game is janky as hell to play, you clip through objects sometimes for no reason, and it's obtuse as fuck. I mean, some people really like obtuse puzzles in their games, I guess, but this is no Zelda 1. In Zelda 1, the entire game itself was an obtuse puzzle, and even though I personally don't like that, I know a lot of people do. Here it doesn't feel like it was intended at all. You just sort of try items on monsters until they die, or you try different items on different puzzles until they just work. The story is essentially just another Zelda plot. Get the 7 whatevers from the 7 places. There's nothing really interesting to discuss here, though. I mean, sure, a lot of Zelda games are like that. Link to the Past in particular had to do a lot of groundwork, so it didn't really have much going on in terms of its plot. But I expect a lot more from my Zelda plots. By the time Zelda's Adventure came out, we had already gotten Link's Awakening, which is easily one of my favorite plots on any game. A story about the non existent lines between dream and reality, the ephemeral nature of things, and how eventually everything stops existing at some point. But this is just another get all the things plot. And all three of these CDI games have failed to deliver me anything really substantive in that department. Zelda's Adventure has nothing notable about it besides the bad live action acting, but the difference is that the live action acting is significantly less funny than anything in the other two CDI games. It's just sad, especially once you know the context of the workload behind it. Everything about the game is really sad, from the lackluster plotting to the uninspired NPCs to the downright ugly graphics. I'm incredibly concerned for the people who had to work on this game, and I hope they're all okay. But that's all three of the CDI games for you. This one is just significantly more so. I think if we've learned anything today, the Zelda CDI games were certainly something. Born out of a series of negotiations that ended up with Sony creating the PlayStation and becoming a threat to Nintendo's market stranglehold Sega could never dream of being, and dying with a whimper of some rushed out games that nobody ever really liked. Sure, you might find some apologists here and there for the first two games, for some reason, but Zelda's Adventure has had no defenders from what I've seen. And despite how much I feel for the poor work conditions the staff that worked on the game had to go through, I can't really say I disagree. At the very least, we got Morshu out of it, which is a huge bonus. This has been Arcade Everlasting, shopping for lamp oil, rope, and bombs, signing off. Thank you for watching.